Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Leah, and I work at the library. Thank you for joining us on the first night of our first online Mountain Story Festival. And it's our annual literary festival where we merge great storytelling and writing. And thanks for joining us. And we have 6 events this year, and it's spread out over several weeks in January and February. And there's 3 writing workshops and 3 presentations: a photography presentation, a travel presentation with family, and writing workshops. So join us there. You can find more information on Facebook and our website. And before we start, does anybody have any Zoom questions, logistical Zoom questions? You can control what you see. So you can control gallery view or speaker view. If you have gallery view, you see everybody's squares and you see everybody who has their camera on. If you put it on speaker view, you will see just who's speaking at the moment. So you can control that. If everybody keeps themselves on mute during it, it creates a better environment for hearing, so there's no ambient background noise. So that's always good. And I will probably mute you if you're not muted and there's lots of things going on. You can write things in the chat function, which is like the little speaker bubble, write messages to the group or to people that you know, private messages and stuff like that. You can put questions in there. So that's how that works. Anybody have any questions so far on that? Loki?
I just wanted to ask if people are talking, if they can get closer to their mics, because in the beginning I could hear some of you well and I couldn't hear others of you well, and I've got my volume all the way up.
Okay, we'll do that.
Thank you.
Loki, how is my sound for you? Is that okay?
Good. Yeah,
good.
That's good.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, so I will introduce Katherine. And we've had Katherine a few years ago too, teaching about her body essays, and that was really wonderful. And now she's come out with her memoir, so we're excited to have her back. And I don't know how many of you have read her memoir, but it starts off in Jackson when she's living here and is having problems that she has to contend with. So it's exciting. So there is a local thread to it. And all right, Katherine Standefer is the author of Lightning Flowers, My Journey to Uncover the Cost of Saving a Life, which was named one of the Oprah Magazine's best books of fall 2020, selected as a staff pick by the New York Times Book Review, featured in People magazine and on NPR's Fresh Air, and awarded a starred Kirkus Review. The book was shortlisted in 2018 for the J. Anthony Lucas Work in Progress Prize from Columbia Graduate School of Journalism and the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard. Standifer's work previously appeared in the Best American Essays 2016. She has been a Logan Nonfiction Fellow at the Carney Institute for Global Good and a Marion Weber Healing Arts Fellow at the Mesa Refuge. She earned her MFA in creative nonfiction from the University of Arizona and teaches at Ashland University's low residency MFA. Standifer lived in Jackson Hole on and off between 2000 and 2009, and now resides on a juniper and pinyon-studded mesa in New Mexico with her chickens. Welcome, Katherine.
Thanks, Leah. It's so great to be back. So great to get to do this. I wish I were there, although I probably would not have run today. Maybe I would have skied. Yeah, thanks everybody for being here. I wish it felt feasible to run through everybody so that I knew who we had sort of in our room. But I think at 27, we have a few too many folks to go through everybody. But I wanted to begin by hearing from just a few people about what brings you here today and maybe some of the projects we have that people are working on that may pop up in conversation throughout. I tend to be someone who really prefers to draw on audience wisdom or audience direction in terms of what is useful to you and what questions are seated in this group of people. And then of course I do have some short passages we'll look at together under screen share and some more general concepts to run you through. For those who have not read Lightning Flowers, The book tells the story of my troubled relationship to my own implanted cardiac defibrillator, which is a device that ideally would be life-saving, but that in my story is not necessarily life-saving. There's a lot of sort of flipping back and forth on whether the cost of making the device in global terms is worth it, and also whether it's worth it in my body, whether the problems that I experience in terms of the technology outweigh the benefits of that same technology. And that's not true for everyone, but my story is definitely this kind of wrestling with this idea of having your life saved by a medical technology, and then really see all of the different twists and turns and baggage that can go along with that. So what is relevant in terms of our conversation is that the book contains a lot of memoir. It tells the story of how at age 24, as a skiing and climbing and hiking guide, I went into cardiac arrest in a parking lot on Hanson Avenue in downtown Jackson near Center for the Arts. I don't know, Manish, have you been in town for a while too? You look familiar.
Thanks. No, I wish I had been in town for a while. My wife and family and I moved out in May, so we're brand
Okay.
new.
Okay. I just was trying to gauge like how many folks we might have that knew that it was like an old motel with a gravel lot, and now it's underneath a real fancy set of houses on Hanson. But that's where it was. And, it changed my life. I not only had gone into cardiac arrest as a climbing guide and ski instructor, but I was also uninsured. And it was 2009. And so the healthcare debates were raging. Obamacare had not yet been passed. And so part of my story is really a healthcare story, the first leg of which occurs pre-Obamacare, and then the second leg of which occurs within what the Affordable Care Act is able to offer, and unfortunately what it's not able to offer in my story. And I made some pretty careful decisions around how to render not only the heart condition itself, which is pretty technical, but then all these passages about the technology, and the technology ends up breaking, which is very technical and has its own history. And ultimately, I didn't go as far into healthcare policy and this healthcare system, although I think readers experience that illumination through the things I lived. That's sort of the goal in that thread of the book. But then there's this whole other thread of the book where I'm really asking, what does it take to make what we think of as a life-saving device? And is it possible that lives might be saved in the context of individuals in the West, and yet there are all these other impacts in terms of how mountains are dismantled and how toxins are released in that process, in the process of smelting, shipping things across the planet, factories. And so in chapter 3, I visit 2 of the plants where St. Jude Medical made my actual defibrillator that was in my body at the time. And then later in the book, I go to Madagascar, South Africa, and Rwanda, and I actually went many other places in the American West and around the world, but those were the ones that seemed to carry the story best. And so there's a kind of hybrid rendering of research in those chapters where I read far, far, far more than is in the book. And I talked to so many experts, and very few of those interviews are actually in the book. But what they gave me was the ability to know that I was basically to know my shit, right? To know that the way I was portraying things was accurate, really learning the contours of the whole iceberg so that I could show the right tip that might plant things for readers in a careful way. And so those chapters really combine journey narrative, in which I go to some of these places, with forms of research that were not embodied. So little bits of information from white papers, from books, from interviews. And yeah, all of that means that there was just a lot of structural work that I had to do in order to contain that much research without it seeming draggy, bogged down. Also, there's a lot of syntax level work to make things buoyant, elegant, tense, again, not draggy, dry. We have these ways that many of us have been trained to think about research because of the way the academy operates, that basically like the actual research is fascinating once you get into it, but if you try to just approach it as an outsider, you will fall asleep because things are intentionally written in this style that no one in the public really wants to access. So yeah, we'll be diving into a couple different angles of that, but please know that I'm open to any inquiries that sort of fall in this whole wide spectrum. Chances are I've had to make a decision about that type of research or rendering that type of research that we can bring into the conversation. So without further ado, I would love to maybe ask, let's do 6 people introducing themselves, just to give us a little bit of a flavor of who's in the room. I do like to say at the beginning of Zoom classes that I completely respect anyone who needs to leave their camera off. I'm all about consent. Also love to invite like into the room folks who are willing and able to be there, because it makes my teaching experience a lot just easier to connect with folks and to feel like I'm not just talking to myself, which pandemic book tour is a lot of talking to yourself, it turns out. So yeah, feel free to fall where you need to fall in that spectrum, but I would love to see you if you feel comfortable today. The other thing before folks begin introducing themselves is that I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm giving this presentation on occupied land. If you are in Jackson, you are on traditional Shoshone and Cheyenne land. I am on Pueblo land where I sit. And I think when we're talking about research, it just can't go without saying that there are all of these layers of history operating around us, and that so often what good research does is connect parts of the story into our storytelling that we haven't been acknowledging. And some of you were at the class that I taught on Saturday morning through Jackson Hole Writers, and so you already dove deep on that that aspect. But if tribal land acknowledgements are new to you, I want to recommend an app called triballands.ca. You can find it on the App Store, and it will show you, you know, whose traditional land you are on, which is one way to begin thinking about other actions like paying a land tax to those people. So let's start there. I would love to hear from a few of you, your name, where you're located, and what's bringing you here today. And if there's a sort of condensed version of the project you're working on that you want to share with us in terms of like what research questions are coming up, I would love to hear that. And you can feel free to just unmic yourself and hop in. I know it's a little bit awkward. If you want to raise your hand, I can call on you if that feels less awkward. Go ahead.
I just got an email yesterday from Melissa Snyder, who is the Kidlit writer group here in Jackson. I'm in Jackson. I am always open to learning about writing information. I don't have a writing project right now. I'm mostly an illustrator, artist. So that's my whole story. I'm muting.
Everybody, my name's Gabe, and I am working as a freelance journalist at the moment, but I'm also a lifelong student of the biological sciences, and I have a bachelor's degree in biology, and I haven't really been able to connect those two things, so I don't have a specific project, but a career goal of mine is to write about science and about biology more specifically.
Great, thanks, Gabe. Nice to meet you.
You too.
Hi, I'm Karen. I am from the Jackson Hole Conservation Alliance. I am the development and marketing manager there. I also, under that umbrella, do communications. And one of our goals is to incorporate storytelling in our communications as a way to both communicate really dense information. We do a lot of advocacy and policy work that's very dense, but we also find that it's very empowering for people to, and the ability to connect through story. So that's what brought me here today.
So nice to meet you. Bueller?
I wasn't going to go because I'm also here from the Conservation Alliance, but hello, I'm Claire and I'm a community organizer, and my job basically is to listen to people's stories and then inspire them to act on their experiences and get involved in our advocacy work. So I am really interested to hear what we're going to talk about.
Fabulous. Nice to meet you, Claire.
So I'm Susan. I'm actually in Cheyenne, so I'm not a Jackson person.
Amazing.
And I have sort of a lifelong love of nonfiction. I read an entire book on rest and loved it, and have done some historical research in Wyoming. So don't have a specific project in mind, but.
Great to have you from Cheyenne. Anyone else feel comfortable dropping into our pond?
Sure. My name is Manish. I think I spoke a little earlier. I live here in Jackson with my wife and 2.5-year-old daughter and my mother as well. And I'm the head of the Jackson Hole Community School, which is a 9-12 school here in Jackson.
Cool.
And, we always try to promote lifelong learning. So trying to walk the walk and talk, just like we talk the talk, and no projects in mind, but I am very confident I'll come out of this with a lot of inspiration from all the great people that are on the call, as well as you, Katie. So thanks so much.
Great. Good to have you. That was 6. Wow, that went really fast. Maybe just because I'm aware of, like, I don't know. You guys, I love meeting people, and this pandemic is really hard. Great. Well, even if you didn't introduce yourself, you're still welcome to weigh in at various points through this class. Don't feel like that was the one portal where you may be present. And feel free, if you want to introduce yourself when you do speak, you're welcome to. I wanted to start broad and then move into a couple different categories of things, because there's a very particular way that I think about writing that you don't have to agree with, but I think it's a place to start. And I think it's been useful for some of my students in other contexts. And that broad start involves thinking about what makes good writing. What makes good writing in terms of an essay? What makes good writing in terms of a book-length work of nonfiction? I can't profess to know all the ins and outs of how what I'm about to say reflects on, like, poetry. There's probably a lot of other nuances there. It's been a really long time since I studied poetry. So please know that this is really operating in the context of nonfiction. But I want us to be thinking in terms of 3 categories today that add up into pieces of writing that are successful. And those 3 categories are syntax, structure, and thinking. So can anyone on the call sort of, like, I don't know, offer a few quick words about what syntax is? Is that term familiar to people? How would you define that? You can feel free to drop stuff in the comments or unmute yourself.
I'll take a stab at it without Googling it, so we'll see. But I would tend to think of syntax as sort of this intersection between grammar and colloquialism. It's like all of the rules and then how you break them.
Oh, I love that. I see that Wendy Call added, which by the way, Wendy Call is a wonderful writer if you guys don't know her. Wendy said, getting the right words in the right order. So the intersection between the rules of grammar and colloquialism. What are the rules and how do we break them? When do we break them? What does it mean to have the words in the right order? I boil syntax down to sentence level choices and sentence level choices that add up to paragraph level choices. And those sentence level choices create tone and texture and atmosphere, and ultimately they can do a lot of work to pace a piece of work. So there are sentences we might write where the words we choose and the order we put them in feel slow, feel baggy, feel stilted, feel unsensory. And then there's a way we could write that same sentence sometimes that feels tighter, maybe is paced differently, maybe contains more slip, more stuttering, more sonic quality. So I think in nonfiction, we tend to place a lot of emphasis over on the thinking and over on structure. And we often let syntax fall by the wayside a little bit. There are wonderful nonfiction writers who are poets. Gretel Ehrlich is one of Wyoming's best, although I think she lives in Montana now. But if you haven't read her book, The Solace of Open Spaces, or she has this book of poetry that I was obsessed with when I lived in Hobart called To Touch the Water in Your Body. I think I basically checked it out repeatedly from the library. She had that ability to make you feel something through the words she's choosing and the order she's putting them in. You know, we're not going to dive deep into pacing on this call. But I think one of the main craft problems of research is pacing. And so when we write sentences that move the way we want readers to feel, we're not just delivering information, we're delivering the information with this added layer of functionality that's doing something on a manuscript level. So when we look at, we'll look at a couple things on a shared screen together. I'll do my best. Syntax can be really hard to teach. For me, I think some of it comes from having grown up a songwriter and being very attuned to the way that rhythm falls, the way that the sung rhythm is different from the guitar rhythm, is different from the banjo rhythm, and the way those things can layer, and the way a song might contract and then like really open and then crest, right? There are these sort of movements we feel in music that we can feel in prose. But it can be hard to do. So when we're thinking about rendering research elegantly, an underutilized tool is thinking at the sentence level. And so that's sentence structure, and it's also what words. And so one of the things that we can think about doing together is actually picking out synonyms for a particular phrase, that you don't have to say things the way you first think to say them. There may be a different verb that carries a little bit more of a menacing quality. And maybe that's what you want readers to get from the research you're sharing. And it doesn't need to be dramatic, but there's just these subtle differences in how we experience words. So that's sort of the syntax piece. Structure. What are some of the synonyms or parts of structure that folks here would toss out? Like when you think of structure, how do you explain what that is? What's included in structure?
It could be like a form, like is it a recipe or is it a poem or is it prose, or so it's the scaffolding that the writing takes.
I love scaffolding as part of structure. What else were you going to say, Loki?
Just how it's organized, how you present.
The organization of the prose, organization of ideas. Loki used the word form and referred to like something being a recipe. So there may be these external structures that we borrow in order to structure a work. In the most creative sense, there's a whole category of things called hermit crab essays. If you haven't read them, they're really fun. Some of them are rejection letters that aren't real rejection letters, but they're like the kind of rejection letters you might write if you received rejection letters from all of your exes and all of the jobs that fired you. I wrote a hermit crab essay that was a annotated bibliography. I wrote one that was an advanced directive. So there's a way of capturing some of these existing forms and repurposing them for creativity. But beyond hermit crab essays and like that type of form, are there any other synonyms for structure or explanations of structure folks would throw out?
I always deal in outlines because that's a written form of structure that we can create, and then go from there.
Victoria, for you, what makes a good outline?
I try to be very formal about it, different ideas in the main heads and then subheadings under there, at least 2, although I don't always do that. And under those and under those, and Microsoft Word is a fabulous tool for that.
So in that kind of outline, we're thinking about what topics go together.
Yes.
Like what is one thing we want to talk about? And then what are the smaller pieces of that thing that fit there?
Yeah.
How do you decide what the order of those main topics are?
It could be chronological. It could be in order of importance. I may identify 5 or 6 things that are really important and look at them and figure out which one comes first. Some of it's just organic.
Yeah, you know, Wendy said that syntax involves the right words in the right places. And for me, structure is, do we get the stuff we need when we need it? So how does the essay frame itself? Frame is one of my favorite craft concepts in nonfiction writing, because so much of what happens with personal projects, whether we start with the research and have to organize it, or whether we start with memoir and are adding research into it, we often just feel like, oh my God, there's so much. And frame is the way we indicate to readers what belongs in this work and what doesn't belong in this work. And that's true not just on a work overall, it's true chapter by chapter. So, and a chapter begins to signal to readers, here's what we're going to be doing here. There's a form of tension. There's some kind of opening that gives us a sense of where we are and where we're going. The tension draws us forward. And we might not know where we're going to finish, but we understand that there is material out there that might be sort of related, but that would feel kind of random put into that chapter or put into that book. And part of why my book felt so unwieldy, and for a long time, I actually couldn't get a grant. I did a lot of this research on crowdfunding because I think it looked too ambitious to people. I think they didn't understand what the frame was and what would go in it and what would not be in it. And that makes sense as a concern, because it took me a really long time to figure out what parts of the iceberg didn't get to come. But when we're talking about structure and research in a particular work, part of what can make research dull or draggy is if we're stuffing stuff in that actually doesn't belong. And like, it was interesting to us, or we did so much work in that area. And so we want to use it, but the frame is narrower than that. Or even worse, we're not even framing the thing, right? We haven't signaled to readers what belongs in and what doesn't belong in. When you think about a well-framed picture, which in Jackson, you know, there's all these beautiful galleries with different types of work. The question of when a frame adds and when a frame takes away, and how a frame changes what is actually inside as art, how the shape and color of the frame draws out certain characteristics of what goes inside it, or causes you to overlook some of those characteristics. So frames for me have to do with often how we enter, how we exit, like what the arc of the thing is going to be, and the subtle ways that we're signaling to readers what belongs and what doesn't. I will say that within the course of a book length work, if any of you are working on book length works, you can get away with a little more if the frame of the book signals that something might belong. And it's a little weird where it is in a chapter, but it also can kind of be in many places. I refer to that as floater material. There are some parts of research that have to be in chronology in order to make sense. And then there are some parts of material that don't really. And one example for me is I went in the spring of 2015. Was it 2015? It was 2015. I went to Hamilton, Texas, which is a tiny little town that my family, quote unquote, founded, which unfortunately means my male ancestors were involved in driving out the Comanche. And so my family has this long history in this town. And in 1899, my great-great-grandmother died at age 20. Very suddenly. She was 5 months postpartum. And long QT syndrome, which is the genetic heart condition that I have, often expresses in postpartum, and it most often expresses for women in young adulthood. And so when we were trying to figure out what side of the family did this come from, there was this one woman in 1899 who died suddenly at age 20, 5 months after giving birth. And we now have gotten a genetic test from my dad, and we do know that it's from his side of the family, which all but confirms that it was indeed this woman. But often what you're looking for is the question of like, who else died young in the family? Is there a pattern of car accidents or drownings that could actually be the heart condition adding up? And we didn't have any of that. We just had Lena Proctor Standifer. And so I went to Texas to look for her grave, and I didn't in the end find it. I like trespassed onto my family's old land. I found old maps at the assessor's office and with the county clerk. I mean, it was like a whole caper. And that trip, the question of like, when is it important for me to think about having this heart condition in a pre-modern medical care situation? Like, should that happen at the beginning? Should that happen near the end? Should that happen chronologically? The rest of the manuscript is not in strict chronological order for a lot of reasons that I'm happy to talk about. But I really had to think about like, this trip carries its own little arc, and it can slot into any number of chapters, and it would serve different roles in different places. It's primarily about like me being resistant to the technology and wondering if I'm allowed to be resistant to the technology, or if that's just really fussy because she didn't have the chance to access that kind of care. She just died. And like, am I just kicking the gift horse in the mouth? And so where I ended up putting it as a piece of research in narrative was in a place where I felt like readers might get overwhelmed with the amount of time they're spending having medical things explained to them. Medical stories are really hard. I don't know how many of you have been drawn to my work and to this workshop because you also have an illness narrative or a caretaking narrative. But medical stories have a lot of play-by-play. And that's not something readers really like. You know, you keep doing appointments in offices that kind of look the same, the appointments repeat. Maybe there's an epiphany or some kind of dramatic thing that happens there, but it's like pretty predictable. It's rarely actually fresh feeling unless you're really good about your character building and the sort of like swell of what builds up and takes you there. And so I was in a very logistical part of my story when I dropped this piece of research in. And so structure there became a way of thinking about the pacing, like does the research have to be in a certain spot, or can the research be employed in service of different things? And how do you recognize spots in a given manuscript where that might happen? So that's one example of the way that structure can play out as a good piece of writing. But I would say this question of like, do we have the stuff we're craving as readers where we're craving it? Do we have stuff, have the meat of a work doled out in such a way that we stay with it, where maybe we're hungry for things, but we're not so hungry we're lost. We're not like, I don't have what I need to keep reading. My interest is lagging, right? So is there anything that folks would add in terms of what structure is or what structure isn't in terms of good writing, especially as it relates to research? Anything that's coming up for folks? Yeah, Leah?
Mark, do you know writer Mark Sundin? He lives in New Mexico, I think now too. But he was a Mountain Story speaker a few years ago too, but he gave a whole workshop about story versus structure. And he says the story has to happen chronologically, but the way you tell it doesn't. And he had everybody write the story on Post-its and then mix up the Post-its into how the story got revealed. But I like what you're saying too, that because you're not just like the research part of it is different. Like how do you put that understanding of what you know about these things, that other stuff, rather than just your story. So you contextualize it in the greater conversation. So that I think is interesting and worthwhile.
Yeah, I love that you're using the word context, because I do think in terms of research that structure has a lot to do with what types of context we need at different moments. You know, in my story, I wake up from a surgery and learn I have a broken wire stuck in my heart. And then there's another surgery where they try to remove that wire and it snaps off. Spoiler. Although I talk about it all the time in interviews, so it's not really a spoiler. And as they're trying to pull it out, the insulation gets stripped from this snapped off wire in my heart. So there's a lot of technical things there. Like, does a reader even understand what a lead wire is? What does a lead defibrillator wire look like? What types of things does it have to accomplish? How does it end up broken? What are the implications of it being broken? What does it take for it to not be broken later? What does it take to remove it? So the drama of that moment hinges upon some basic understanding of the stakes of all that really technical stuff. And that was a huge craft challenge, because first I had to understand and then had to think of it as story, had to turn it into something that is still elegant and tense. And the question of like, how much of that is too much? There's actually a section where I talk about how lead wires were developed and sort of the different ways engineers have tried to solve over time this problem of needing to have a sensor in the heart that is accurate, that stays in place in order to make decisions about what type of electricity should go to that heart, whether pacemaker or defibrillator. The sensing capability then leads to the ability to send electricity into that heart in a way that could save a life. But the heart is always flexing. It's always moving. You know, the best metaphor I read came from Kirk Jeffries' book, Machines in Our Hearts. And he talks about how if you wiggle a paperclip back and forth, eventually it snaps. And so if you think about the heart doing this, and then you have a piece of metal that needs to like stay in place in the midst of that, and it's wet, you know, like there's blood and tissue and just like a lot going on inside the body. And so how do you make sure you're delivering the right amount of electricity to the right spot and even sensing what is needed correctly? So the engineering challenges are actually really interesting. But this question of like, what does it mean for a wire to break? Well, actually, wires break all the time. It's a real standard of that industry. There are a ton of product recalls that I write about in the book. And that's like a disturbing fact that a lot of patients don't know when they say yes to the technology. And so actually part of how I slow down my own march from surgery to surgery is by taking the time to really contextualize this story. And some of that then ends up being me reading research. So the structure sometimes sort of personalizes that research process. Since I was researching then, it's like more grounded to hear it coming through my body. And then in other places, it's more that like step away and here's a long paragraph about the New York Times expose on this product recall. And so I think one of the questions for turning research into elegant prose is understanding what context is necessary where. And again, being a little bit ruthless about not including things just because you researched them, but actually including just the pieces that are speaking into the stakes of the story, really like putting wood on the fire that you've been tending to throughout that frame section. Is there anything else we should touch on in terms of structure before we move forward? Right stuff, right place. We'll be sort of circling around this, so feel free if something comes up in a little bit. So the last piece is thinking. The last piece of good writing to me. And thinking, I want to define a couple different ways. Thinking, like if we were talking about fiction, there are some works of fiction where the thinking is real robust, and then there are some works of fiction where it's going to be operating on a very nuanced level, where mostly we're watching characters do things and move through situations. So thinking can be, in nonfiction, it can be essaying, which Montaigne really familiarized folks with that term. To essay is to attempt. And so to essay on the page is to attempt to sort of be with the wanderings of something, try to explain something, move discursively. Maybe you're saying something really straight ahead in terms of like a good op-ed. Maybe you know exactly what you're saying. And then maybe in other works, you're really wandering around. And so the thinking of the essay can move differently. The thinking of a book can move differently. It also, we can talk about it as reflection. So character reflection is a form of thinking. For someone, for you as a narrator to be in a place thinking about something, thinking on the page is thinking. And so I wouldn't get intimidated by this idea that it has to be like, you know, a huge grand idea. But I will say that as someone who's read, you know, a ton of essays in progress, what we're often missing in a draft that's not working yet is that level of meaning making. That maybe there's a lot of stuff that happened, but so what? Again, what are the stakes? And so with research, the thinking is, what do we make of all this? How does the research start moving us into either one type of answer or multiple answers at once? It is my sense that every good piece of work is asking a question. And some works very directly answer their own question. And some works really don't answer their own question. And their goal is to get you to think about it so deeply that at the end you're still asking it and you really understand the question. One of the books that comes to mind in terms of this for me is Francisco Cantu's The Line Becomes a River. I don't know if folks have heard of that book, but he was a border patrol. He joined the border patrol hoping to help, quote unquote, which may have been a naive move on his part, you know, believing that he could help contribute to that system improving from the inside out. And so it's the story of what it's actually like to be trained as a border patrol, as someone whose Mexican grandfather crossed the border in the early 1900s, and as someone who'd lived in Arizona his whole life, who'd studied international relations. What was it like to be trained as a border patrol? And then over time, he folds in all these sections about the history of the border and the history of worker programs that allowed people to cross more easily. And in the second half of the book, Francisco Cantu has a friend that he's very close to from both work and some like a pickup soccer community that he's a part of. And that friend is deported. And so all of a sudden he's no longer border patrol, and now he has to navigate our system on someone's behalf, kind of from the other side, and, you know, travels down to the Mexican border to see his friend and talk with his friend. And then we'll travel north of the border and see his friend's kids. And the way the book ends, you have a sense of like, you have some very clear feelings. The story is very embedded in you. You still probably can't like make the policy decision, right? The question is you're very intimate with the question, but the answer is still complex. And you know how complex it is because he's done a good enough job showing all these countervailing forces and the total inhumaneness of the way border policy is playing out there, and also the long history of how it has ended up like that. So thinking there's some of it that is maybe subterranean, just by giving people certain lines of research, by giving people certain descriptions, we create sensations or experiences in their body. And then on the other hand, some of the thinking is actually connecting those dots and actually saying some things. I'm curious, as I'm talking about thinking in particular, whether there are books that are beloved to you that either definitely answer their own question as I'm talking about that component, or that leave you intimate with the question and don't answer it. Is there someone whose reflection has been important for you?
I'm reading right now, and I haven't finished it, so I'm only halfway, but Cynthia Cruz's essay collection, Disquieting.
Oh, I don't know that.
Yeah, it's kind of new, and it's about silence and the body and trauma and how silence is a way of speaking, and how neoliberalism's effect on the body, and specifically in eating disorders. So she grapples with all these questions, and she like refers to all these films and articles and stuff like that. So for so far in the essays, the question, like she is grappling with the question, and I'm trying to paraphrase the question, like, how do we exist in the world of so much inconceivableness, or something? That is her main question that she goes throughout the essays.
Thank you for that recommendation. That sounds like right up my alley. And that's really an interesting set of considerations. Anyone else? Let's see, I think something just came through chat. Barbara Kingsolver's Animal Vegetable Miracle has a research memoir style related to the American food and agricultural system. Yeah, that's an interesting one because you almost see, yeah, your form of intimacy with the question is watching her live it. And she makes it possible to emulate her. You know, the book includes certain recipes and tricks and tips, but they also run into some some problems, certainly. And so it's not simple. Anyone else? It's a good question to walk with. You know, think about the books you've loved and what how you would summarize the question they're asking. What's the territory that they're walking, and where do they fall on that spectrum from forceful polemic op-ed, the answer is here, to who even knows what the answer is, but the territory is mapped in some way. I'm trying to think of another good example of that second side. My epilogue gets much more pointed because I could tell that I needed to both offer next steps, because it's not that I don't know some things that I think should happen. Like, you can't research something for 8 years and not have some ideas about who should be accountable and in what ways and how we might tweak programs. But at the same time, you know, it is sort of an unanswerable question to be asking whether or not saving your own life is worth a certain amount of ecological devastation, particularly when you can't even necessarily point to the exact place on the planet that a device is from. You know, my research, I have essentially a battery, a capacitor, a titanium box that they're all in, and then a set of microelectronics, which is nickel, cobalt, gold, silver, tantalum. I mean, there's just an extraordinary list of things inside me. So there's so much imprecision, and the question asking becomes more important than the answer. Someone added, the spirit catches you and you fall down. I have not read it, even though it's sitting on my shelf. I feel shamed. But a very well-regarded book. I don't know if anyone else has read that and wants to speak to the answerability or unanswerability of the questions in that book.
There's a nonfiction book called The Most Human Human, and I can't remember the author, but it's about the Turing test, which is a test for like computer AI creators to test their AI, and they get points or they win if like the humans interacting with the AI think it's human. And you also get points if you're a human interacting with a human and they know you're human. So it's like trying to answer the question of what is distinctly human that computers can't recreate yet.
Interesting. Oh, that's so disturbing. Thank you. Yeah, really interesting. So I just want to take a moment to reflect. I know not all of you have a project you're working on. I know a few of you certainly do. When you think about the research that you're doing, or the research you would be likely to do, or just your writing more generally, and you think about these categories of syntax, structure, and thinking, where are your skills the strongest? Where do you feel like you understand what you're doing? And where do you feel like you aren't able to harvest as much of the possibility of maybe one or more of these categories? Does anybody feel comfortable sharing a little bit about their work? And we can take a minute if if I need to write that in chat so you can sort of look at it. Let me see, what did I just say?
I'm working on an essay and a book project about working as a caregiver for a 90-year-old mountaineer. And I've been writing down our conversations for the past 2.5 years. So I have a lot of really great dialogue, but now I need to find a story arc and create scenes and kind of pull it all together in a way that people who do not know us and have not been following our story could understand.
Yeah.
So I'm finding that challenging.
Yeah, I have seen your posts on Facebook, Anna, and you have a very lovely sparse style. But I see how, like, if you're knitting all those together, then at some point that style becomes actually a constraint. Like, how do you slip in the appropriate context?
Yeah.
I'm curious where you are with that story.
Well, the past week or past 2 weeks, I went back and read through my Facebook archive, all of the posts that I've done about him, and came up with almost 350 pages of really raw material.
Yeah.
And my instinct as I went back was to cut out and remove the parts which felt shameful or embarrassing or complex. And then the next day, as I was brushing my teeth, I realized, oh shit, that's the story. So today I went back and I pulled out a bunch of the messy bits. And I want to write an essay first that addresses all of that. Because I think one of your other talks, you said something about your monsters. I don't know what I have it written down here.
Therese Meyer.
How to own your monsters.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's where I am right now. I think the shame, what I call the shameful parts, have to do with poverty or being audited or having desires and hopes and dreams in life that probably won't happen. For me and for him. He's 90 years old and he desperately wants to find romantic love. And we've been trying and trying and trying to find him a woman, and he just gets rejected over and over and over.
Oh, buddy.
So like it's real messy stuff,
That Anna was the elevator pitch of a book. Right? The heartbreaking reality of living into these understandings of, like, sometimes the story is not what we think it is. Sometimes the things we want are actually not what will be offered to us this lifetime, despite best attempts. And, like, what does it mean to have a good life despite that? What does it mean to maybe keep trying for the things you want, but also to still exist in vibrance? I mean, when so I haven't been friends with Anna on Facebook for that long. We're connected through a writers group. But a lot of the pieces I see involve this man getting out for very small outdoor adventures. A man known as a mountaineer who it's a big deal to get a ski that's an hour long, or to go hike for half a mile or whatever it might be. Maybe his distances are different than that, and I am not remembering right. But that, I think, has a lot to tell a lot of us. And I can say that when I'm thinking about, it's interesting because Anna, the story you're talking about, the experiences are the research in some ways. I don't know if there's other research you end up doing that is book research or interview research, but being with this human is part of the research. And I think for me, there was a real process of looking at centers of gravity and spots of heat and understanding like that center of gravity or that like hot coal is what everything else should be worked around. And so do I open with that hot coal and then we try to understand it? Do we try to build up to how that hot coal got under someone's bare foot? Right? Like there's a real way that every chapter in my book is serving a larger center of gravity. And also each chapter has its own center. And there was a lot of stuff that got cut out in terms of chronology, or got cut out and then got compressed into this tiny bit and like was snuck inside something else. And so I think this question of like, if you have so much research, how do you begin to get it into like what the real story is? And where chronology starts kicking in, I think has a lot to do with what the centers of gravity are that you can organize things around. What is it that really gets readers asking the question that is at the heart of things? And I should just say that like, we write a lot of things where we don't know what question we're asking for a long time. This is not like, now I shall sit down and pick out my question. Although sometimes that works. You know, I think the reason I sold my book on pitch was that I understood what the question was. And so it was easy for people to come along for that ride. But I think a lot more of the time we're sort of like, you know, batting around. And research can end up being the scaffolding, the tissue that helps showcase the story in a way that makes it land. So thank you, Anna, for offering that into this space. Oh, Anne Marie is asking, what do you mean by sold my book on pitch? I mean, I sold my book not having written the whole thing. So sometimes people write a book and then they sell it. And sometimes people get an agent and have a proposal and some sample material, and they sell to a publishing house. They go under contract to write that book without having the whole book already, which I was extremely fortunate to be able to do, because I don't think this book would have happened if I was responsible for writing the whole thing without deadlines that threatened to kill me and expectations and advance money, frankly. And advance money, in case that's not a familiar term, refers to the publisher giving writers an advance on royalties. So it's not free money. It's not just a payment you get. It's actually an advance on your book sales. And usually writers receive 3 chunks if they sell on pitch. So you receive the first chunk of your contracted money when you sign your contract. You receive the second chunk when you turn in the book, and you receive the third chunk at publication. And then you don't get paid again until you've sold enough books to pay back that whole amount. So that's just the 30-second version of publishing, big house publishing, I should say. Did anyone else want to share when they think about structure, syntax, and thinking, which ones are coming most easily for you in your project and which ones are not so much, especially in terms of research?
I'm working on a project about a woman. She started up, Dr. Luann Freer, started up a emergency or a medical clinic at the base of Mount Everest, and using during the climbing season. And her motive for starting it was because she's not a climber nor a mountaineer, is an ER doc, and her motive in starting it was going there and seeing the way that the local support staff was being treated, which not uncommonly resulted in significant illness, even death. And things have changed a lot since then, but using the stories of the creation of this nonprofit entity as sort of the vehicle for, and sort of the sexy medical and rescue stories as the vehicle for talking about some of the social justice and public health issues in Nepal. And when you have the paradigm of very high end, luxury isn't quite the word, but it is luxury in the realm of mountaineering, tourism coming into a developing country. And so I am struggling with that question. I still haven't figured that one out, but I do find, coming from more of a journalism background, it is a big step for me to step into a place where I am judging more and making those sort of thinking comments versus simply giving the facts. So that, and feeling okay about that, and that I'm not going to lose the reader's trust too quickly by showing judgment, and finding that balance, if that makes any sense. So the thinking part is a good stretch and challenge for me. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that in, because I do feel like strict journalism, that style of reporting, really holds back on thinking. Not that thinking shouldn't be expressed in a piece, but it should be expressed by other people.
I actually went to CC too, so I don't know if you ever took any classes with Levy, but I minored in journalism there. So I'm a few years older than you are, but at any rate. Yeah.
Oh, that's so great. Yeah.
So that's a good challenge. I don't know if you have any suggestions for that, but that'd be, how to get more comfortable.
just by doing it. For sure. Yeah, it's a different standard. And I think too, there are key places. Are you writing in the first person?
No, I'm trying to do it creative nonfiction style. So all through very intensive interviews with her and other people.
More like profile.
Associated. What's that?
Like profile or long form journalism.
Yeah. So I guess third person. Well, yeah, through her, everyone else has character. So I guess third person, that would be
cool. Oh yeah, that's really interesting. That is a really delicate layering, right? Because it's not exactly your thinking.
Yeah.
But although it is, right? And that's where one form of research that I think gets buried sometimes in like preliminary conversations about what research is. Like we think about books, but this act of interviewing people is about recording what they say. And it's also about watching their faces. And it's also about asking, when you were in that place, how were you feeling? How were you feeling? What did the other person look like? Like, can you describe what the weather was like that night? What color was the tent? Maybe you have photographs you're working off of. And there's this sort of world building that comes from documented pieces, but you're still developing the thinking of the essay through which details you show. And that sort of, thinking, structure, and syntax do not operate independently of one another. And that's like a really beautiful overlap that we just stumbled into, because the choice to show certain details, when you show a character who's deeply uneasy, you're setting up for readers that there's something to be uneasy about. And there's a sort of thinking contained in that, especially in the context of the longer piece. And again, the tip to find out, like, recreation of things we were not present for is really its own particular type of research, sort of historical fiction or reporting out these events that other people experienced. And my experience going to Texas really showed me the importance of taking things that seemed flat and embodying them through myself. So looking at the black and white photograph and then finding a way of describing that in terms of syntax, where there's actually like a felt sensation. And one of the tips that I carry most preciously around that is always finding out what the weather was like for any scene, finding out what the geography was like. One of the details in that section about Lena Proctor was that it was the worst winter weather on record. There were all these tornadoes that touched, I think the line is tornadoes touched down near Pottsville. And when the woman at the historical center said that, I had asked her specifically, like, would you have a way of looking this up? I can look up the sort of almanac categorized data that's available online for what was the record temperature. You know, a lot of this is available through Googling, but this woman at the Historical Society really was able to track down, like, okay, in Lena's last winter, she would have been listening to the wind tear at the trees. And listening to the wind tear at the trees. Tornadoes touch down near Pottsville. You can hear the rhythm there, that there's something that happens where we're with this 20-year-old woman up at night with her baby by gas lamp, listening to the wind tear at the trees. And we know she's about to die and she doesn't know she's about to die. And so the verb tear as a form of syntax and the sort of casualness of tornadoes touching down. There are different ways that those scenes could have been written, but I felt very grateful that if I was going to make readers like read about some dead woman from 1899 that we really can't know that much about, at least this woman at the Historical Society was able to give me these details that allow us to be there and that set up the feeling of that thing. And so talking to people about how each other looked or what people wore or what the weather was. Weather is just such an amazing, you can write about the same sunny day a lot of different ways that will carry different tone. And knowing what someone's window looked down on, knowing what their favorite shoes were that winter, like what would they have probably walked like, even if you never saw them walk in that period. There's just a lot of like research finding that is creating this precious cache that then you turn into syntax that has feeling and there's thinking embedded in that. Does that make sense? Thank you for sharing about that project. That's fascinating. I would like to have us just take a quick 5-minute Zoom break so that folks can use the bathroom if they need to. I know some folks have been maybe popping on and off or changing position. And so, you know, if you ever need something, of course, like just go ahead and do it. It's less disruptive on Zoom than any other time. But I do feel like it's still important as humans to feel like, okay, we're standing up now, like wiggle it out. It is 7:19 where I am. That's Mountain Time. And so let's just come back at 7:25 and we'll touch back in for the second half. Thanks, folks. Okay, just briefly using my voice to call people back if they went somewhere and are listening. Let's see. Okay. Welcome back, folks. In this second half, we're going to look at a few parts of lightning flowers so that I can break down for you some of the different forms of research that are layered in that hopefully feel to you like research has been turned into story. If you don't feel that way, I guess it's okay if you don't like my book. I have 3 different sections, and I want to start with chapter 11. So just as a little bit of framing, chapter 11 is, about halfway through the book. Ultimately, there's 16 chapters, including the epilogue. I guess that doesn't make chapter 11 halfway through the book, but you feel like you're pivoting from sort of the first range of material into the next range of material, chapter 11. And you've already, as a reader, had 2 different chapters about this trip to Madagascar that I did. Those 2 chapters were about a nickel and cobalt mine carved out of endemic jungle in the Malagasy highlands. And they introduced a lot of concepts about mining and how we consider projects in non-Western countries in terms of like, what does it even mean to be responsible? Like, what is corporate social responsibility, and what are some of the different programs that guide what a mine does or doesn't do, and how should we consider it? And all of these are framed as journey narratives, and then have that layering of other types of research that I was talking about that I hope do not feel too weighted. I want to talk a little bit first, because chapter 11, then I go to a different mine in the south of the country. It's a titanium sands mine. I mentioned before that my defibrillator, which is right here, is a titanium box that then contains microelectronics and a battery and a capacitor. And it's plugged in up here, and then that wire runs down my vein into my heart. And so titanium is what is holding everything in. And I went to this ilmenite sands mine, which becomes titanium oxide. And then some titanium oxide becomes titanium, and some titanium oxide becomes pigment in our toothpaste and on our walls. So when we're talking about titanium white paint, although I have a blue wall behind me, so maybe not there, maybe this one. If you have a white wall, you probably have titanium oxide in your proximity. It's a disturbing chapter because it's like about defibrillators, but actually just about what it means to be in an industrial society, and what it costs to get some of these minerals, and then how we use them in very sometimes frivolous ways, actually. So yeah, chapter 11, we're going down to this second mine, and the reason I went to this second mine is because there had been protests there. So the first mine was, what are the best case scenarios? Can corporate social responsibility make enough of an impact on the way material comes out of the ground that I would feel good about it being in my body? And then here's this other mine that has a much more complicated record. And what does that look and feel like? And I want to pause there because I think, as we talked about before, there are all these different types of research. And one type of research is to put your body in a place. So a question that I would turn to you is, when do we need to just read about something or listen to interviews about it or talk to someone? And when do we actually need to put our body in a place? Does anyone feel like their project has some version of that answer. You probably can sort of guess that because my whole book is about my body and the whole beginning is about worrying that there are conflict minerals inside me, like how is my care, how is the thing that might save my life implicated or complicit in these larger global dynamics. And could I have done that research without going? Well, certainly I write about some minds that I didn't go to. And also, what do you guys think it does to actually put a body in a place? What does it give you to work with as a writer?
I was doing some research on a town in Eastern Laramie County that no longer exists. But the only thing that exists is the cemetery, and it's still maintained. There's still a cemetery society. And so I went out to the cemetery. It was like this community of 100 hardworking Swedes that has just disappeared. And it gave me some things, like some of the inscriptions on the tombstones that were unexpected. And gave me a sense seeing graves that even though it's been forever since this town existed, there were still people in the last decade or so being buried out there, like there was still this connection.
Wow.
And so it's not a sense I could have gotten from anything else other than going out there.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, the ability to describe newness of graves, to see how weathered the plastic flowers are. Like when we're talking about research that feels like story instead of feeling like dragginess, detail is our God. So what you're talking about, Karen, like the details actually give us the story. And one of the moments in my visit to Lena Proctor's, my attempt to find Lena Proctor's grave, is that for a minute it looks like the headstone of this great uncle of mine who died as a prisoner of war in Manchuria during World War II in the Mukden camp. His grave looks like all the other World War II vet graves. It's sort of this white marble, but it's on top of another grave, and none of the other World War II vets' graves are on top of another stone. And the stone that it's on top of has this kind of like mossy, it's this older type of stone with moss that's grown on it. And I slid David's gravestone off. And I was going in with my fingers scraping because I thought there was going to be writing on that stone. And there were grooves. And I was like going in. And then they just were like weather grooves. and that moment of drama, like, did I find her grave? And what does it mean that someone else was buried on top of her? Which I think still might be possible. I think the second wife might have been like, you know what? We don't need this old wife who died 30, 40 years ago to be in this plot with us. I want my son right here. But that moment of drama was arc, and all of that sensoriness made more room for the thinking, right? Because we can talk about things. We can reflect differently on the page when we are actually looking at the plastic flowers or feeling the way the wind moves across that plot. So very appreciative of that, Karen. Literally, we can't know what we need to know when we don't go sometimes. Not all the time, but sometimes. And there are implications to our bodies being in certain places. One of the parts of my book that was most surprising to me at the time was that I did not understand what it meant for me to put my white American body in some of these villages that had experienced such things from multinational corporations that are run by white Western bodies speaking English. And it made writing those sections really hard because I had to do the work of reckoning with the way people had responded to my white American body and the way I felt in my white American body. And writing whiteness is something that's really urgent right now. A lot of us who are white writers write as though that's not even a factor at all. And it is a layer of experience that is really inextricable from the types of story outcomes that we're having, or the types of subtle dynamics that are unfolding with other characters or in places. And so, yeah, what does it mean to put your body in a place? And then what are the moments that, like, you know, I'm trying to think of a place I described. Oh, wait, here we go. It's what I picked next. I'm going to share my screen so you guys can see, and I'll read from this, chapter 11. The reason I want us to look at this is, although I did go to this place, I wrote this opening long after I'd been there, and really as a way in, because there just was a lot of contextualizing that you have to do when you write from a place like Madagascar. People don't necessarily have any frame of reference for what you're talking about. So I'm going to read these few paragraphs and then we'll dig into some of the different forms of research that are embedded here. So chapter 11, Fort Dauphin, Madagascar, 2014. If you trace the island down its eastern seaboard from the port of Tuamasina, just before its end, you will come across a series of long half moons of coast, framed by peninsulas that jut out like misshapen feet. The town of Tolignaro, still popularly known by its French colonial name, Fort Dauphin, forms a messy web between two of them, hemmed into a narrow corridor between the ocean and the foothills of the Annoncienne, black cliffs velvet with green. The northern moon is Shipwreck Bay, the southern Libinona Bay. In the curving belly of Libinona Bay sits the Port Douala. By the time I arrived in June of 2014, the port had been dredged. A long jetty of white stones broke water for the wharfs. Beside the dock sat a warehouse, a shipping container yard, a raised belt for loading, and orange container cranes with webbed steel sides. The quay was suitable for cruise ships, those big layer cakes of white metal and windows that crossed the Mozambique Channel from Durban. Oil arrived at the Port Douala, along with cheap rice, cars, and shipping containers of supplies from international aid groups. What went out was scrap metal, mica, spiky purple lychee, crayfish, vegetable oil, fresh fish, and sisal. But mostly what went out was the ilmenite and zircon. Just behind the port, atop a stubby black rise, the land still bore the marks of those who'd lived there, faint trails through the brush, timber cut in wide swaths. But the people were paid in cash to move up the spit into small blue houses with metal roofs. And the fishermen who spent days casting their nets in Libinona Bay in wooden pirogues were given boats of fiberglass, boats with engines, so they could roam into parts of the ocean that had more fish, though the fishermen would tell me they got far fewer boats from the mining company than they needed, and that many of them joined the strike that blocked the road to the mine. In any event, the port was appropriately isolated, open for business. Just inland lay the airport, and south of there, the quarry, another mountain missing its face. What was once mountain became the road, became the thin piles of riprap in Libinona Bay, the 2 years that kept sand from slipping away. This was all a World Bank project, the port and the road, in coordination with the Madagascar government and the mine. In town, the muddy back roads were now squared cobblestone, which gleamed in the rain but did not run. A neat asphalt highway ran between the quarry and the port and on through town toward the mine. If you looked closely at this coast, you would see the sand swirl dark with what looked like dirt or ash. You'd see it in the places dunes poured out of the grass. You'd see it under your feet as you walked barefoot beside the water. This black wash, this was the metal. The road to Mendrum and Rotra I said that wrong. The road to Mendrumdrumft, not kidding, that's the actual way you say it, was bad. Dude, I said, as a 3 foot deep red hole passed to our right. My interpreter, Tina, grinned, carefully angling the wheel of the truck, a shiny red Nissan we'd rented from his uncle. A slender man with a round nose and a head of curls, Tina had been so quiet on the day we'd met that I wasn't sure if he liked me, but his English seemed solid. He was the boyfriend of a British NGO employee, and he'd worked with researchers and film crews in this area. Now that we were out of town, he seemed to be lightening up. That is a very bad one, he said, smirking. It was the protest that had snared me months before, showing up in my searches as I made preparations to visit Ambattuvi up north. To study the potential bright side of mining was interesting, but was I really going to go all the way to Madagascar and not travel to the south, where there had been a protest, particularly when the mine in question produced ilmenite, the mineral that becomes titanium? I had a titanium can at the top of my left breast. I had to visit. The Mineral Sands Project, QIT Madagascar Minerals, known locally as QMM and owned 80% by the Anglo-Australian mining giant Rio Tinto and 20% by the government of Madagascar, is a high-quality ilmenite deposit in Fort-de-France that, if fully exploited, would account for nearly 10% of the world market at 70 million tons. Created with an investment of 940 million, QMM had been the first large industrial project of its kind in Madagascar. Construction began in January of 2006. The ilmenite extracted there, I learned upon arrival, would be purified into titanium dioxide concentrate, or titaniferous slag, the vast majority of which would become titanium pigment, the high-quality white painted on our walls or dotted on our toothbrushes. The global market chewed through titanium white, while a much smaller percentage of the concentrate went to titanium metal producers for the aerospace industry, artificial hips, and, of course, defibrillator cans. In reports about the protest, I read that locals carrying spears and slingshots blocked 200 workers, including the chief executive, inside the QMM site, protesting the low prices paid for their land back in 2006. In 2011, a group of around 1,000 villagers had filed a class action lawsuit in UK courts, but the lawsuit was dismissed after the company settled with so many of them that too few litigants remained. On the day of the protest, they were also demanding that more locals be hired. In town, I'd heard that although the mine officially hired mostly locals, a certificate of residency was easy to come by. That some of the people supposedly local to Anush, one of Madagascar's 22 regions, looked remarkably like the Marina, an ethnic group in the highlands who traditionally lived around Antananarivo. I'd heard rumors of people paying for access to the rare positions at the mine. How much truth existed in any of these charges was unclear, but the rumors themselves seemed an expression of the ways the mine had disrupted the town. With the opening of QMM, hotels sold out for 2 years, collapsing the tourism business. The flow of sex workers and mining money into the area spiked sexually transmitted infection rates, and of course, the cost of living increased. We'd followed the glossy black asphalt highway through downtown and then out toward the mountains, in the narrow space between foothills and the sea. It was the best road I'd traveled in Madagascar until it wasn't. It seemed we had gone off the edge of the world, the red dirt rising and falling in crazy crater-like ruts. At best, we bumped along on washboard. We passed men riding bikes with giant precarious sacks of charcoal strapped behind their seats, thick black sticks poking out the end of the bundles. There goes the forest, I couldn't help thinking. The mining company only builds the sections that benefit them, Tina said of the road, which at the moment, with my eyeballs rattling in my head, seemed a gross injustice. So I will stop there, but I wanted to take you into this opening because I didn't write it in Madagascar or from notes from Fort-de-France. Well, I shouldn't say that so broadly. The opening paragraph, that is generally true of. If we look at this, you can see that embedded in this moment, chapter 11 comes after a series of chapters. The last Madagascar chapter was chapter 6. So it's been a lot of chapters since we've been in Madagascar, and we haven't been to this place yet. One of the places we were in chapter 5 and 6 is Tuamasina. And so one of the choices I made The chapters that come in between are from 2009 when I had my first ICD placed, then 2010 when I became septic, and there's sort of a whole arc there in which I almost die and my partner leaves shortly after I get out of the hospital. And then in chapter 10, we're going to 2012, where I have just taken 3 shocks to the heart. And that's a moment that readers know from the prologue. So there's been some like real weaving happening. And every time I open a chapter, part of the frame is that we need to know where we are. We need to know what date it is. And then I need to be aware of like, what's the last bookmark? What's the last landmark they had for this place? And so to start in Tuamasina is at least like a half bone to readers. Like, okay, we were in Eastern Madagascar before. Now we're tracing the island down its eastern seaboard. I don't have to launch into this chapter quite as fast as the other 2. Both of which are they open in media res. So in chapter 5, I open on a mine tour of the nickel and cobalt mine. And very quickly, there are these very disturbing paragraphs about the way the forest is being dismantled. And then in chapter 6, I'm hiking deep into a conservation area that is being saved as a biodiversity offset. But in that chapter, you learn that the local people who have used that land for forever are suddenly no longer allowed to use the land in the way that they have always used it. And so there's a deep trauma even associated with the biodiversity offset that is supposed to be saving species. And instead it does so by kicking out the humans who are actually a part of that ecosystem and who don't have anything else to do or any other way to make a living. And the mining company's attempts to sort of put a Band-Aid on that are really insufficient. So in this chapter, readers already have their feet wet in Madagascar and in thinking about mines. And so there's a sort of like grounding and flirting that I'm doing in these opening paragraphs. These descriptions right here, just before its end, you will come across a series of long half moons of coast framed by peninsula. I was literally on Google Maps tracing down the coast from Tuamasina. Like, what does it look like? Is there anything of use here? I didn't know that it was going to work when I did it. I had my pen out and was sort of noodling phrases like, what does it look like? If I'm going to describe this area for people, what are some of the ways I can do it? And this idea of having these half moons of coast actually turned out to be important because most of those half moons of coast are places that the mining company wants to mine for ilmenite, if not now, later. They're sort of the future deposits. I need to make sure that people right away understand that on maps, you're going to see this as Tolignaro, because I mean, I don't in the end go into this much, but Madagascar, like many colonized nations in Africa, received a lot of colonial names and then had a period after independence of sort of like renaming things according to how they wanted them to be, ways that better honored the language of that place or the longer history of that place. But in Fort Dauphin, it was one of the only places where the colonial name had really stuck. And so I wanted to honor that, like, the experience of moving around that place is really Fort Dauphin, but it needs to be Tolignaro. And then this little line here, black cliffs, velvet with green, in characterizing the Anocien, that's coming from my pictures. And I didn't even in my body totally internalize what the place looked like to be able to just shoot off descriptions. Like, certainly some places there might be a little of that, but the pictures I took were really, really key. And so one of the things that, is, I think, in the description for this class is these strategies for note taking. And the question is, what is the information that you will need in order to build scenes that are rich, or in order to bring readers into a place? And I am very big about taking at least a few quick shots of anywhere I am because that stuff is gold. The next section here, I think I was supposed to visit the port. I think I had one of the port guys was like at dinner and I didn't have a notebook, and I don't think he knew he was with a journalist. This is one of the places that my white American privilege really showed up, that if you arrive in a place like Madagascar, the expat community is like, oh, a white English speaker, why don't you come to all of our things? And so you sort of enter these networks of power very easily. And so I didn't know that much about the port, and I couldn't quite put all the pieces together when I was there. I was much more focused on like, I need to talk to as many villagers as possible. I need to like understand the protests. I need to understand the mine and what the larger dynamics are here. But the port ended up being really important because it's one of the places that people were removed. Another instance of villagers having really getting kicked off ancestral land and having a resettlement town built for them. So this section is built largely off the website of the Port Douala. And when I pulled up that website, I was looking for, what are the pictures? Like, how would I describe what this looks like? What are the colors and shapes and textures? What are the implications? You know, I didn't necessarily know what a jetty was. Like, I'd heard that word, but it became important to do the brief research of like, a long jetty of white stones breaks water for the wharfs. Because this is part of the World Bank project that is gesturing towards some of the larger questions of these mining chapters in the book, and sort of who the powerful decision makers are. And so it feels important to talk about the way that industry not only requires a mine, but requires a road, which then requires a quarry and requires a port so you can even get this stuff out. And that as a result of the port, you end up with these giant ships from Durban. And so those big layer cakes of white metal and windows that cross the Mozambique Channel from Durban, part of the texture of this place is like, it's not just mine, it's also tourism. Like, for people who don't know Madagascar that well, like, what is it even close to? The Mozambique Channel. The tourists come from Durban. This sort of listing of what the imports and exports are leads into then talking about this mine in a different way. Did I walk the land behind the port? I did not. So the stubby black rise, the land still bearing the marks. My friends, it's Google Maps. It's literally the satellite images and me zooming in and zooming in and zooming in. And of course I had been there, so I knew what to look for. And I was looking for anything I could describe. I didn't talk to the people who were moved into the small blue houses, but I did drive by them and I talked to my interpreter about them quite a bit. I did spend several days in fishing villages. So here's one of the places that, in the name of moving and maintaining tension and allowing the piece to focus itself and not get bogged down in the fact that like, and I did this, and I did this, and I did this, like so much research. But ultimately, all that was important was to say, you know, the fishermen who spent days casting their nets in Lebanon Bay in wooden pirogues were given boats of fiberglass, boats with engines, so they could roam into parts of the ocean that had more fish. Though the fishermen would tell me they got far fewer boats from the mining company than they needed, and that many of them joined the strike that blocked the road to the mine. I didn't know when I went to the fishing villages if they would tell me something that made them the story, but ultimately they were one little piece of the story. And however much I was proud of myself as a reporter for being in those villages, or thought individual like chiefs of the village were great guys, right? Like they were beautiful villages. There are a lot of things I could have included, but ultimately this piece didn't want to focus itself on those fishing villages. And so this is part of the way that I'm creating a layer of complication that we can sort of tuck under our belts for later. What does end up being of importance in this chapter is that I go to a village. This is where Tina and I are driving on the road to Mendrund, which I'm sorry, I messed that up sooner. I didn't know the appropriate way to say it until I was recording my audiobook and had this like little recording over and over where I was trying to get it right. But that village is where someone told me people are giving birth to things which are not babies, which was so disturbing to me that I didn't even know how to consider it. And it takes up room in that chapter because it's like, are you talking about miscarriage? Are you talking about birth defects? What is it in ilmenite mining that causes that? And I basically have a crisis around being a white woman who wants an epidemiologist to confirm this for me. I can't just trust the villagers because we don't know if ilmenite is causing those symptoms. Maybe it was happening before and it just feels like it's happening more now, or maybe it's happening from something else entirely. And like, as a reporter, I'm in way over my head and like, how do I even consider this? And that's the more important story. So the fishermen, like, so lucky they talked to me, and they sort of show up twice in these little condensed sections. This quarry is interesting. The mountain that is missing its face. I like met this guy and his wife at the fancy hotel. You could tell I was an American and he was an American, and he was like, do you want to go for a hike with us? And they took me to the quarry and we like hiked around the quarry, and I would not have even known there was a quarry. So this is where, like, to put your body in a place. I could have written about this story from articles published in The Guardian or published on Manga Bay. It's mentioned in a few like conservation academic books. I found all that, I read all that, but ultimately, like, the theme of a mountain missing its face is something that happens over and over in the book. And so to go to that quarry and to then be on the cobblestone road and understand, like, oh, that's from there. There's a sort of density of poetry that's possible because I know how things fit together. Again, not always important to go there, but sometimes it is. And this asphalt highway, I'm kind of fronting for the scene we're about to have with Tina. Let's see, obviously this is just a scene from research. Although, you know, I have to introduce him as a character. And then we sort of go back into research mode. And this is the section that I was really hard on myself. I really wanted to be able to write this from my own interviews. And my interviews took me all over the place. I just had so much material from people. I like interviewed this woman who flew to London as part of these lawsuits, who some of the people thought she was like the great defender of the people, and some people thought she was like not even from Madagascar. She was technically from Réunion, which, if you don't know that island, it's like off the coast of Madagascar. And she was richer. She had lemurs in cages at her house. Like, she had a treadmill. There were like all these weird things going on. And I had to basically say, like, that's not the story. I mean, it is one story, but for me, I really, like, for me, the heat lives in this village. And then the heat lives in a later section in which I go to visit the mine, and actually the mine is beautiful visually because it's just sand with swirls of black metal. It looks like you're inside a bowl of cookies and cream ice cream. And the guy from the mining company took me to this forest that was another conservation property. And I was so grateful to be in a forest in the quiet, and he was so grateful to be in a forest in the quiet. And so that center of gravity in tension with these villagers who are giving birth to things which are not babies, and other villagers who've told us about being kicked out of the forest and how there are cameras and guards who keep them out of these ancestral places. So I pretty much was like, okay, well, that's one story I can have, but it's not the story that's important to me. And so I basically built this whole section off other articles that had been written. I think the main one was from The Guardian. There was another one, I don't know if it was in foreign policy, but here's where we're looking at like, how do you condense down other people's research? In some sections of the book, I do a lot more like, according to a November 2006 article in The Guardian, XYZ. And here, this attention, like moving readers' attention to the fact that I'm using an outside document seemed distracting. It's like, I'm going to build off fact-checked material and be careful who I'm citing, but not cite in the text. And that's part of what's different with academic writing and with some forms of journalism. And then with, you know, a memoir that is creative nonfiction. So these facts, my goal is to move as quickly through as possible. People have already gotten a mining primer of some kind. I'm remembering that one of the facts that got taken out by an editor that like I thought was kind of cool, but ultimately slowed it down too much, was that the Malagasy legislature actually passed a special law for this company so that they even had a legal framework to be able to sign a contract like this and open a mine like this. That's interesting, but it was too slow. It was too slow. And like, you know, my book isn't about how the step-by-step process by which countries undergo development. So unless it's circling back later, not important. I need to make sure people, here we go with context. Do I understand what ilmenite actually is? Do people reading understand like why this mining is so important and the sort of balance of that? You know, I didn't want to pretend it's all going toward defibrillators. When you see the way that I am translating other people's prose into my own prose, I'm looking not just for like key context, like construction began in January of 2006, like that's kind of a basic point. I'm also looking for those images, the same way we talked about like description can be our God. In reports about the protests, I read that locals carrying spears and slingshots blocked 200 workers. Even though we're reading something that's not from my body, we have an image in mind. It feels like story. Where are the images in the things that you're cannibalizing for your own work if you are using other written material? And then you can see, you go from these articles that I'm drawing off of back into my own experience. And it's forms of experience that are either hard to fact check, but worth touching on, or the scenes themselves didn't have a hot core, but the information in light of other things is like, again, building those layers. And so on the day of the protest, they were also demanding that more locals be hired is not from me. In town, I'd heard that although the mine officially hired mostly locals, a certificate of residency was easy to come by, is me. It's something I heard over and over. And ultimately, I wasn't able to fact check it in a way that felt suitable to me, but because this is my memoir, it's okay to say I'd heard rumors. It's okay to say how much truth existed in any of these charges was unclear, but the rumors themselves seemed an expression of the ways the mine had disrupted the town. The sort of considering of like, what's important about what I'm hearing, whether or not it's true. And how do I characterize it so that readers know it might not be true, but it's what I'm hearing over and over. And like, that's something. I think I just pretty much stopped there. Let's see. I read this last paragraph. The glossy black asphalt highway. These are notes I took. The best road I traveled in Madagascar until it wasn't. Crazy crater-like ruts. You can imagine my notebook was like, you know, full of the bumpiness of the road. And what I'm thinking about is like, it's not that interesting to hear people talk about deforestation or hear people talk about a lack of infrastructure, but it's very interesting to experience it. And so there's a kind of handing off between like when I'm going to use what some kind of source is saying about something versus something that I can be the narrator of. So I'm gonna unshare my screen just for a second so I can see all of you. Oh, we lost some folks on that one. Thanks for staying, those who have stayed. I'm curious what in that breakdown strikes you in relation to your own projects. Are there pieces that feel really useful to you about the way things are getting boiled down or the way things are layering into one another?
I really liked your description. And one of the things that I find with my memoir, I'm writing about my travels in Iceland from, let's see, 4.5 years ago now I've been working on this story. And I forget where it was written, but someone who is an author said like I don't want to know about the interior decorating of a house, you know, and people go into a super lot of detail about what the rooms look like. And I worry that I fall into that same trap with the landscape. Like how much detail is too much detail to the point where they're just like, enough about the flowers or like enough about the sheep, okay? So it's like trying to find that balance between setting the place and then just moving on to tell the story.
Right. Oh my God, so well said. Right. Yeah, and I think a little bit of it is there's going to be a group of people as readers who just have more appetite for that, right? Those of us who love nature writing are here for it. And some other folks are like, you know, happy to move ahead without a lot of that. But I think there's a question about like, what do the sheep serve? What do the descriptions of the inside of the house serve? Where do they get in the way of pacing versus how does their rendering make us feel creeped out in a place or make us feel suddenly settled in and warm after a long, really cold trek of some kind, right? Like any detail we want to be serving on multiple levels. And I think there's a real sharpness to detail that in its beauty, like when we do it well, in its beauty and in its rhythm, the poetry does, we don't want to walk away from it. We're here for it, for the quality of the language. But most of the time, that quality of language is also building out our world in some really essential way. And yeah, how you strike that balance is so, so tricky. Anyone else find themselves sort of in the inside of their project as they're thinking about like, where is it story through my body? Where is it story that is sensory, but I'm borrowing it from photos or borrowing it from a map? And then where is it actually white page research or article research that gets run through the processor of your own brain? Oh, Molly, you're muted.
Sorry. This was a really interesting discussion for me. And I so much appreciated you laying out so many of the details of how you can go about finding facts. I am finishing up a school program, and so still eligible for some different grants however, a lot of the grants for research require travel. I have a spinal cord condition that medically doesn't enable me to travel. And so one could argue that there is a form of discrimination in there based on disability. And I think that is a real challenge for folks, that whether for financial reasons, for physical, and I guess I sort of hesitated to bring this up, but because of the whole context of your writing, I do bring it up. That whether it's medical condition, medical, physical, emotional, or socioeconomic, or
Right.
Elder, being of age, or your gender situation may not make travel safe or even physically possible for you to do. So I think it's great, the emphasis that you're put. Of course, I mean, those of anyone who knows me in this group, I mean, a lot of my life is based on travel. And so, of course, I mean, that's the ideal. And I appreciate how much emphasis you put on all the little details and ways to extract if you can't travel. So
Yes.
I found that really helpful and positive and sort of reaffirming. So thanks.
Yeah, so important. And thanks for highlighting that. If it were up to my father, as someone with a heart condition that can't always be treated in these places, I would not go. And as someone who has lived with death in sight for a really long time, and who also strangely has these periods between surgeries where so far able-bodiedness has come back. But there was a period that I could barely walk. And yeah, I just really feel what you're saying. And there's a sort of magic to finding the poetry of place through image and through interviews, and like not even through amazing sources, right? Like describing the port through port website. Like these are not artistic pictures, but bringing attention to the quality of the words that are being chosen. A long jetty of white stones broke water for the wharfs. I really wanted that to feel like wave, wave, wave broke water for the wharfs. There's a kind of like shifting in that feels like being in a port. And I think since we got to that section, I'm going to pull up a different type of excerpt that is not reliant on travel, because I feel like it's a nice bridge. So here's one of the descriptions that was hardest for me. Oh, such a good question, Melissa. I just am seeing these notes. I remember the titanium white from Bob Ross. That's awesome. Yeah, capturing details in the moment. Melissa, is she still on the call?
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
you actually definitely addressed it. I mean, just saying that you take quick snapshots. I'm just picturing, I mean, I write for Teton Family Magazine here and there, just, general like local interest article types of things. And when I interview people, I've realized I have to record the interviews and then transcribe the interviews, or else I am up a creek because I don't catch all the details. Yeah. And again, what you're saying about like knowing the entire iceberg, so much of that, I mean, I'm writing 1,200 word articles, so barely anything makes it into the article in terms of quotes. But for me, it just lends all of that understanding so that I can write an article with authority. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, everything moves so fast. And when you're traveling through a place and you're trying to capture it in your mind, especially a place like where you were traveling, I would imagine for me, it would be kind of overwhelming with detail, just so much newness and things that I hadn't seen before, experienced before. Anyway, I think photography is powerful because you can capture those moments, and we have these little devices now, we can just carry these around and document everything.
In the kind of blurry picture, like turning a circle in a place, and then later you're like, oh right, there was a dead tree in the center of the town. Like, right,
and it's just
that's a beautiful line. Yeah. I saw a lot of things. So I had bad translators by and large. Tina in the scene we just looked at was the best of my three, and he was the last of my three. And if I could go back, I would have like I don't know, actually known how to report. I really did those trips with the bravado of someone who wanted it real bad and thought she was going to be dead. So it was like, okay, I'm doing it now. I'm crowdfunding this and we're making it happen. But I wish I'd known what a fixer was. I wish I'd had some like journalist networks. And some of my early translators were so not good that as I was taking notes on those scenes, it was almost gibberish. And I read white papers for years to make sure that what I'd heard in that village also seemed to be what other researchers were hearing. And at the time I went, I probably could have broken the story. No one else was going there. But I took so long to write the book that other sources became available that then I could borrow from. And some of the lines, especially in chapter 6, the layering, some of it is from my interviews and then some of it is from these outside sources that I just felt like, okay, I really have gotten enough. But yeah, the quick pictures and just lists of nouns is really important for me. Lists of nouns, you know, like I'm listening out of one ear as I'm interviewing someone, and I'm also noticing that there's a whole shelf of 3 Horses beer, and that a woman inside has built a fire and someone leans in to light their cigarette on that fire. And like, if I don't have those details, the pacing of the scene is going to be all off. I've got to have real characters doing real sequences of things, even if I also have good dialogue, which I often didn't have good dialogue because of translation. And so being aware of like, this man is in a blue windbreaker, and then not taking the time to describe the guy in the blue windbreaker if he's one I got a picture of, sort of like triangulating. There were people who didn't want their picture taken and I had to describe them separately. And then there were people who I got pictures of that I could bring it together. But yeah, I was really big on lists of nouns, lists of sensations, truly, like, you know, some of the book unfolds in hospital settings and I'm out of my mind, but I understood that any word I wrote down was literal gold. It was like, you can use your medical records intensely, but if you don't have the laminate of the floor, or if you don't have the funny thing, Dr. Ackerman, my doctor at Mayo Clinic, that is sort of this hero at the end of the book, he turned to me and he said, the only thing that's been done wrong so far is everything that's been done so far. A man like that would never put that in the medical records, but that is a line, right? And I wasn't recording as a journalist in those settings. So there was this way of just developing, like, I'm moving through space. I don't know if I'm living the story right now, but I probably am. And how do I just cache things away like a little squirrel? So on the other side of research writing, hang on, let me get my screen shared again. Goodbye, sidebar. This is one of the descriptions that almost killed me over the course of a full, like, 8 or 9 years. I think I was working on this description before I went to do my MFA, which is what I consider the beginning of my book. But it basically is, how do I describe this super technical heart problem in a way that people will understand without being medical practitioners? And how do I offer it to them in a way that they will remember enough of it to just move forward in the story? There are some things, like with my wire, I think I repeat that you corkscrew the wire into the heart several times because most people don't know about wires in hearts. And if they missed it the first time, it's like pretty important that the way you get a wire to stay in place is to corkscrew it into the tissue. But this, like, I really needed it to be something they could flip back to actually and like get it. So I'm just going to read this out loud. The genetic mutation that almost took my sister was one we'd never heard of, congenital long QT syndrome. If the heart is a muscle pumping blood by contracting and relaxing, it is also an electrical organ. Each heartbeat unfolds in 5 separate electrical pulses generated in the sinus node, a patch of tissue in the upper right-hand chamber of the heart, rightfully known as the heart's pacemaker. These electrical pulses crash through the heart like a wave, and to monitor them, physicians have labeled each with a letter, P through T. During P, the upper atrial chambers act as the little pumps that load the big pumps, the lower chambers of the heart, called ventricles. The right atrium sends oxygen-depleted blood to the right ventricle, and the left atrium sends oxygen-rich blood to the left ventricle. During QRS, the right ventricle pumps out to the lungs for oxygenation, and the left ventricle pumps oxygenated blood out to the body. During the T part of the wave, everything is supposed to electrically reset for the next beat, a process known as repolarization. If you've ever seen the ziggity zag of a heartbeat on a monitor in a primetime hospital drama, you've looked at the PQRST, how it unfolds and unfolds and unfolds as a heart beats onward. An electrocardiogram, or EKG, is the way we capture an image of the heart's electricity, one that allows us to see if electricity is following the right sequence, peaking and dropping in the right places at the right times in the right amount. We use the same word for hearts and drums. We love a steady beat. A heart is predictable the way tides are predictable, the way rivers in the desert shrink during the day and expand outward at night. And yet we cannot take for granted that the heart will ebb and flow at the right time, because sometimes it does not. In a heart with the type of long QT syndrome my sister has, the physical structure is fine, but repolarization can be prolonged, a problem that becomes exaggerated under certain types of stress. This means the interval from Q to T is, as you might expect from the name, too long. Sometimes when this happens, there are heart cells only half primed at the right moment. So they half fire, triggering other things to half fire. This inconsistency can go unnoticed, a slight palpitation maybe, or it can cause the rhythm of the heart to spin out of control, unable to pump in the firm, organized manner that gets blood oxygenated and out to the limbs and organs. A heart that quivers instead of pumps fails to get oxygen to the brain. The lucky faint but wake up when the heart recovers a normal rhythm. The unlucky die of cardiac arrest. Long QT is most dangerous when you don't know it's there. 21% of symptomatic patients die within a year if they don't receive treatment. There's a long list of medications to avoid, everything from antihistamines to antimalarials, because they further lengthen the QT interval. Though 90% of people with long QT have their first abnormal heart rhythm before age 40, there have been cases of older adults without the genetic mutation who end up with medication-induced long QT syndrome as a side effect of pills they take for other conditions. Okay, it goes on, but we've pretty much like talked through the heart. Really hard. And maybe even now, reading it once, I don't know for how many of you, it's like, oh yeah, duh, now I understand heartbeats. I'm curious, when you look at these paragraphs, what parts, let me see if I can get my row of people out of the way. Can you guys see my row of people, or can you just see the document? Great, okay.
You can see
So
the big stripe of people.
Okay. Maybe, okay, well, oh, I can make it smaller. That's what I can do.
I think everyone sees their own row of people. So, so if you're seeing a row of people, you can move your window and you can minimize it to not see it.
Here we go. Okay, so it's a little bit small as far as text goes, but the main paragraphs here, I would ask where your attention is drawn. Like, what are the parts that are easier to access for you? Turns of phrase, metaphors.
I think for me, more than like the details and the music of it as a reader coming into it, not knowing about heart conditions is, look, it's intense. There's all these details that I don't know, and I still don't know even after reading it. And like it, you know, like even, and here is somebody trying to condense it to just a few pages to make it easy for me. And still I am like, it's still abstract and I still don't know. And then I think like as a writer, oh, what would have happened if we just left it out and said, yeah, I had this heart condition, right? Like, does that, but leaving it out doesn't give the reader the severity of the condition at all. So even if you leave like, oh, I still don't get it, you get it that it's serious.
Yeah, and that like at this point, I don't even have it. It's my 18-year-old sister who's going into cardiac arrest in her dorm room. And like, what? Even?
I think that some of the language that you used made it more accessible. If you've ever seen the ziggity zag of a heartbeat on a monitor in a primetime hospital drama, you've seen this.
Yeah.
We use the same word for hearts and drums. We love a steady beat, the predictability of tides. And those they break up the technical part and make it accessible.
God willing. Yeah, it's really hard. And it's like, okay, why is it called long QT syndrome? Like, you can't talk about long QT syndrome and not tell people in the course of a book what a long QT is.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I have it sort of boiled down for interviews. I can talk about it in like, 2 sentences, but it really matters for the treatment and for what happens in our lives here. And so, yeah, seeking those points. What are the entrance points that someone might have to your technical material, whether it's that it looks like something else that they've seen before, or that they've intersected with it in some pop culture way. The ziggity zag of a heartbeat on a monitor in a primetime hospital drama is something all of us have access to. We just don't necessarily understand what it is. And so how can we use these little windows into the technical detail to at least create some neutral ground in the middle of what Leah just said is, yeah, so intense.
I found those switches to be when you switched from the technical to the sort of layman's, exactly the jolt, like, oh shoot, I was supposed to be paying attention because that was important. so it sort of serves as this like, I don't know, I can't think of the right word, but sort of like, hey, wake up. Hey, you should have been paying attention back there.
I love that. I hope it feels like the safe zone in tag.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Right? You're like, okay, now I'm full of like, yeah, adrenaline. I should have been paying attention, but if I want to go back and read it, I don't have to go that far. It's like I only missed a paragraph. And this doctor friend of mine, we went back and forth because every time I wrote it in a way people could understand, I was getting it wrong. And so this idea of like the big pumps that load the little pumps, or the little pumps that load the big pumps, it's like actually sort of childish language, but the system is so complex that like, pause it after a little bit of that, use the simplest language possible, electrical pulses crashing through the heart like a wave. Yeah, it's not easy. We are at the end of our time together. I just realized, so let me unshare my screen, not new share, just unshare. There we go. I just wanted, if you have to go right this minute, please know you're welcome to, and I respect that. I just wanted to see if any folks had sort of final questions. And I would love, before we close, to hear just one word or phrase from each of you about how you're feeling right now. So first things first is, does anyone have any sort of urgent questions or comments related to everything we just did? We could honestly like talk about this for a month. So I feel like we traversed a lot of territory, and that's good. It is hard work. Yeah, this is like real technical craft. Great. Well, anyone who's still on the call, I would love if there's a word or phrase you want to share. Just go ahead and unmute yourself and pop it out. How are you feeling right now in relation to your project or after hearing this stuff? Where are we closing?
Inspired.
Yeah, definitely inspired.
Motivated.
Awesome.
Curious, because I want to explore that idea of questions. And I think actually for me, I've been struggling for a long time about how to write nonfiction because I want to, because I'm good at describing things that already exist, and fiction is really hard to write, but that's what I've been writing. And I want to write nonfiction. And so I feel like this might be the jumping off point, is to actually know what my question is and go and explore that. So thank you.
That's great.
I thought your presentation was fantastic, and you are extremely brave. I can't believe how you've explored all these different areas to find out the minerals, and it's my mind is blown. Maybe my one word, blown mine.
Mind blown. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'll echo a lot of those sentiments and say, you know, you've made the craft and the process seem sexy when often it's not, or it doesn't feel that way, you know. So yeah, thank you for sharing all of those nitty-gritty details, but making it feel accessible.
I would like to put that quote on my website. Making unsexy craft sexy again. Thank you, Karen.
Yeah.
I would just say that you affirmed some of the processes that I use personally, so that was nice.
Great. That feels really good.
I'd say I feel grateful, and ditto on what Melissa said about the framing and starting with the question, like, oh yeah, duh, let's start with the question and see where that goes. They seem so obvious, but not.
Yeah.
I really liked the deciding what each thing serves. Like, what does the paragraph or the description serve? What is the purpose of it? Is it just to describe, or is it serving a purpose? And so that'll be something that I take away today.
That's great, Anne-Marie. And, you know, pressure off in first drafts. Like, nobody has to serve anything other than like giving you enough to start chipping away at. But I do think
I have like 14 drafts. We're way past the first draft stage.
Generation is not the problem. Yeah, I just love that question as a framing mechanism for moving forward. Anybody else before we close? Okay.
Sorry.
Well, go ahead, Anna.
Sorry, I was talking, but I was muted. I found it really soothing, kind of listening to you read when you were talking about syntax and rhythm and cadence. I got that from listening to you. And I really liked what you were saying about grounding it in place and detail, and also in the body. And I've been trying to think, like, okay, what is the entry point for this essay that I'm working on? And as you were reading, it just came to me that there was a time when I carried the mountaineer on my back.
Whoa.
And it was just like, boom. I remembered it and I felt it. And I thought, there you go. Like, there could be a potential entry of carrying a 90-year-old man on my back. So thank you.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I'm so happy that happened.
Yeah.
Thank you, folks. This was really fun. Come join me for something else. My website has a bunch of stuff. I'm like still in pandemic book tour mode, and a lot of it's free. So it would be great to see you again. And good luck with all your projects. And of course,
Yeah.
reach out if something else comes up.
And if you registered for the workshop, I have your email. I can send you a link to this video and a link to her website and all that stuff. And don't hesitate to be in touch if you have any questions.
And if you didn't already buy my book, I think Jackson Hole Book Trader has been a really beautiful partner. And of course, I love Valley Bookstore as well. So if you're in Jackson, pick it up there.
Yep. Thank you.
And Leah, will you include the books that were suggested?
I'll try to copy the chat and do that.
Okay.
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 Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Bye.